Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you, amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. Thank you so much. Now let the lights soften, let your body relax, and let your breathing slow down. Settle in and sink into the stories that follow. Wishing you a peaceful night and a good sleep. One step too far from safety. I first encountered Evan through a dating app at a time when I believed I was cautious enough not to place myself in unnecessary danger. His profile had clearly been curated with care. Warm-toned photos, a gentle smile, neat clothing, and a short bio mentioning a love for books, morning runs, and an interest in something serious and genuine. His messages were measured, never intrusive, never rushed. We chatted for nearly 3 weeks before agreeing to meet in person. The location was a large park on the outskirts of the city. Public, open, busy, with walking paths, a lake, and a small cafe near the main entrance. At the time, it seemed like the safest possible choice. That afternoon was overcast, the air cool with the faint scent of damp grass. I arrived 10 minutes early and waited near the entrance, watching people come and go while checking my phone. When Evan texted to say he had arrived, I scanned the area, searching for someone who resembled the photos I had memorized. The man walking toward me, however, made me hesitate immediately. He was taller than I expected, thin to the point of looking worn down, his shoulders slightly hunched. He wore a dark, weathered jacket, loose pants, and shoes stained with dried mud. His hair was unkempt, his face gaunt, his eyes dull. It took me several seconds to accept that this was Evan. He greeted me with a brief nod. No smile, no handshake, no apology for the difference between reality and the carefully selected images online. The disconnect was immediate and unsettling, as though I had stepped into a familiar story only to find the main character had been replaced at the last moment. I told myself not to overreact. Photos could be old, appearances could change, but the unease had already settled in. Without explanation, Evan turned and began walking deeper into the park. I followed, uncertain but unwilling to appear rude. The gravel path crunched under our feet as he walked at a pace just fast enough that I had to keep up. Silence stretched between us. I tried to initiate small talk, asking about his work, whether he often visited the park. His responses were minimal, sometimes no response at all. Occasionally, he glanced at me, not with curiosity or warmth, but with a detached, evaluative look that made my skin prickle. The farther we walked, the fewer people we passed. The lively sounds near the entrance faded, replaced by rustling leaves and distant traffic. I realized we had moved far from the cafe and open paths I had initially considered a safety net. I slowed and suggested we head back toward the main area. Evan stopped and stared at me for a long moment. "It's loud back there," he said quietly. "Let's walk a little more." The way he said it did not sound like a suggestion. I hesitated, but continued, unsure how to justify turning back without seeming overly suspicious. With every step, my discomfort grew. I noticed how he kept scanning the surroundings, how he subtly shifted closer whenever the path narrowed, how the space between us disappeared without my consent. Eventually, we reached an almost deserted section of the park. A single, weathered bench sat beneath a large tree, fallen leaves blanketing the ground. A narrow trail disappeared into thicker woods beyond it. Evan stopped and turned to face me. He stood too close enough for me to smell the stale, damp odor clinging to his jacket. My heart pounded, my throat went dry. "Do you come here alone often?" he asked. The question, given the isolation around us, sent a chill through me. I shook my head and said I was meeting a friend who would arrive soon. The lie escaped instinctively. Evan smirked, a slow expression that never reached his eyes, and looked me over in a way that felt intrusive and deliberate. "Your friend," he repeated. "Funny. I don't see anyone." I stepped back. He stepped forward. The distance remained the same. I considered running, but my legs felt heavy, unresponsive. Thoughts raced. Why I had agreed to this, why I hadn't shared my plans with anyone in detail, why I hadn't trusted my instincts sooner. Evan lifted his hand, stopping just short of touching me. "Relax," he said softly. "I just want to talk." Nothing about the moment felt like a conversation. I pulled out my phone, pretending to read a message, and said loudly that my friend was nearby and looking for us. For a brief second, Evan's expression changed. The smirk vanished, his jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. "You always rely on other people like that?" he asked, irritation seeping into his voice. Can't decide anything on your own? The remark struck a nerve, touching on an insecurity I rarely acknowledged. But it also snapped something into place. I did not owe this man politeness, explanations, or patience. I turned and walked quickly back toward the main path. Evan called my name. I didn't look back. I heard his footsteps behind me, not running, but close enough to remind me he was there. I broke into a run. The gravel shifted under my feet, and I nearly stumbled more than once. His voice faded into the background, drowned out by the rush of blood in my ears. When I finally spotted people ahead, relief flooded through me. I glanced back once. Evan had stopped near the trail entrance, watching me. His face showed no anger, no urgency, only a calm that was somehow more disturbing than any outburst. I ran straight to the cafe area, where lights glowed and voices blended together. My hands shook as I called my closest friend, barely able to explain that I needed her to come immediately. She arrived within 15 minutes, though it felt much longer. I sat on a bench, clutching my bag, constantly scanning the crowd. Evan never reappeared. When my friend arrived, I recounted everything in fragmented sentences. She listened quietly, her expression growing more serious with every detail, and told me I had done the right thing by leaving. We reported the incident to park staff, describing a man whose behavior had made me feel unsafe. They took notes but explained there was little they could do without a concrete incident. Their response left me feeling frustrated and dismissed, as if what I experienced existed only in my head, not serious enough to matter. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about Evan. His profile had vanished from the app. I didn't know whether he deleted it himself or if it had been removed. I tried to convince myself the situation was over, but the unease lingered. Every time I passed the park, I remembered the narrow trail and his steady gaze as I fled. A week later, a message arrived from an unfamiliar account. No photo, no name, just one sentence, "You run fast." My stomach dropped. I blocked the account immediately, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I began noticing things I had previously ignored. A man standing near my building too long, a car parked on the corner night after night, footsteps behind me when I walked home late. I couldn't tell whether these were real threats or the echoes of fear reshaping my perception. The climax came unexpectedly through an email from the dating app. It was a security notice, listing conversations removed due to policy violations. Evan's name appeared among them. The note explained that his account had been suspended following multiple reports involving unsafe behavior during in-person meetings, many of them at the same park. I read the email repeatedly, nausea rising with each pass. This had not been an isolated incident. I was not the first, and if I hadn't mentioned a friend, if I hadn't walked away when I did, the outcome could have been very different. When his mother joined the date, that evening began in an entirely ordinary way, perhaps even more pleasant than I had expected. I met Ethan after several weeks of talking online, conversations that stretched late into the night, where we shared a fondness for old films, jazz records from decades ago, and small, everyday frustrations about work. Ethan had a measured sense of humor, never loud, never trying too hard to impress. He replied to messages slowly and thoughtfully, like someone who considered every word before sending it. That made me feel safe. He chose a small Italian restaurant on the edge of downtown, where warm yellow lights fell against old brick walls, where the soft clinking of cutlery created a steady rhythm, and the smell of toasted bread mixed with rich tomato sauce. It was the kind of place that made you lower your guard, that made you believe the evening would pass gently. Ethan arrived a few minutes before me. He stood when he saw me walk in, smiled, and pulled out a chair. Everything unfolded exactly as I had imagined. We talked about a recent Italian film we both enjoyed, about his abandoned attempt to learn cooking, about office jobs that drained people in quiet, invisible ways. He spoke calmly, occasionally slipping in a dry joke that made me laugh. I remember thinking that this was a rare first date that didn't make me want to check the time. The appetizer had just been set down when someone stopped beside our table. At first, I thought it was a server, but when I looked up, I saw an older woman neatly dressed, silver hair carefully styled, her eyes sharp and alert in a way that made me instinctively straighten my posture. She smiled, wide, confident, but not entirely warm. "Ethan, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the restaurant. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Ethan froze for the briefest moment, then his face settled back into calm. "Mom," he said, as though her appearance were perfectly normal. Have a seat. There was no introduction, no hesitation. He pulled out another chair and placed it right at our table. The woman sat across from me, her gaze moving slowly from my face down to my hands, as if she were inspecting something newly acquired. I'm Margaret, she said, extending her hand. Her grip was cool and dry. And you are? I introduced myself, trying to keep my voice steady. Questions formed in my mind, but before I could organize them, she continued. What do you do for a living? She asked without pause. Where does your family live? Are your parents in good health? The questions came one after another, quick and precise. I answered automatically, trying to remain polite, while Ethan quietly tore a piece of bread, as if this were an evening meant only for the two of them. Margaret nodded frequently, her eyes never leaving me. How old are you? Have you thought about settling down yet? These days, many young women aren't very serious, too focused on freedom. A vague sense of discomfort crept over me. These weren't casual questions. They felt like an evaluation, every answer weighed and measured. I glanced at Ethan, waiting for him to intervene, to smile apologetically, to acknowledge how strange this was. But he stayed silent, occasionally nodding along with his mother, like an obedient child. Margaret began talking about their family, about how she had raised Ethan, about the sacrifices she believed no one else could understand. Her voice was steady, almost flat, but every word carried weight. She spoke of women who had previously entered Ethan's life, women who were unsuitable, immature, unable to understand her son. I started to feel short of breath. The restaurant's earlier warmth seemed to vanish, replaced by a sense of suffocation, as though the walls had slowly moved closer. The surrounding sounds blurred until all I could hear was Margaret's voice, unbroken, relentless. Do you plan on having children? She asked suddenly. Ethan loves kids. Our family values that. The question stunned me. I didn't know how to respond. This was a first date. I barely knew the man beside me, yet his mother was already speaking of things far beyond any reasonable boundary. I think that's personal, I said carefully. Margaret smiled, but her eyes remained unchanged. Family is shared, she replied. Nothing is personal once you step into someone else's life. Ethan remained silent. He didn't look at me, and he didn't look at his mother. His eyes were fixed on his plate, as if avoiding the scene entirely. His silence felt worse than her questions. It felt like permission. The main course arrived, but I had lost my appetite. I ate mechanically while Margaret continued talking, continued asking, continued shaping an image in her mind of the kind of woman suitable for her son. Each time my answers strayed from that image, she tilted her head slightly, as if noting a flaw. Time dragged unnaturally. I had no idea how long Margaret had been there. I only knew that I felt trapped in a space without exits. Every attempt I made to change the subject was gently but firmly redirected back to family, duty, and what she called the right way. Finally, I set my utensils down. Excuse me, I said, my voice sounding distant even to myself. I'm not feeling well. Margaret studied me for a moment, as though weighing something. Then she nodded. Of course, health is important. Ethan looked up at me then, the first time since his mother had arrived. There was something like relief in his eyes, not because I was escaping, but because the evening was ending in a way that felt familiar to him. I stood, took my coat, feeling as though I had stepped out of a sealed room. No one stopped me. No one apologized. As I turned away, I could still feel Margaret's gaze following me, heavy and persistent. Outside, the cold air cleared my head. I took a deep breath, like someone breaking the surface after being underwater too long. On the way home, the evening replayed in my mind, the questions, Ethan's silent nods, Margaret's unwavering stare. Later, when I thought back on it, I realized what haunted me most wasn't just the violation of boundaries, but the feeling of being pulled into a structure that had existed long before me, where every role was predetermined, where there was no room for freedom or surprise. That date didn't end with an argument or a dramatic scene. It ended quietly, yet its aftertaste lingered, a silent reminder that some things don't need darkness or noise to unsettle you. Sometimes, all it takes is one extra chair pulled up to the table, and the silence of the person who should have spoken. The third bill. I met Emily on a late autumn afternoon in Seattle, when the sky was covered in a pale gray, as if the entire city were holding back a rain that never quite decided to fall. We matched on a dating app, the kind of connection so common that I no longer remembered what had made me swipe right. Perhaps her smile, which seemed attentive, or the brief description about loving old cafes and aimless evening walks. In person, Emily was smaller than I expected, soft-spoken, and always looked directly at me when I spoke, giving me the rare feeling of being genuinely acknowledged. That feeling was dangerously addictive for someone long accustomed to shallow conversations and unanswered messages. Our first date took place at a small Italian restaurant near the harbor. I chose the place, made the reservation, and when the bill arrived, I paid without hesitation. Emily thanked me, her smile carrying a hint of surprise but no objection. I didn't think much of it. In my mind, paying on the first date was simply polite, almost automatic. We talked about work, about how she had only recently moved to Seattle, while I had been there nearly a decade, long enough to know how cold the city could be to newcomers. When we parted, she gave me a quick hug and said she'd had a pleasant evening. The second date came a week later, at a jazz bar with warm lighting and the smell of old wood. Emily seemed more relaxed, opening up about past relationships and the exhaustion of starting over in a new city. I listened, nodded, and felt myself slowly becoming a kind of emotional anchor, however fragile. When the bill arrived, I paid again. Emily thanked me but said nothing more. In that moment, a small thought flickered through my mind, so brief I barely caught it. Would she ever offer? I dismissed it. 2 dates still felt within the realm of normal. The third date was where everything began to slip off course. We chose a popular seafood restaurant. Nice, not extravagant, but certainly not cheap. Emily suggested the place, mentioning how highly her friends spoke of it. I agreed, carrying a quiet, unspoken hope that this time might feel different. When we ordered, Emily chose freely, the most expensive dishes, drinks, dessert, laughing that she hadn't treated herself in a while. I smiled, but inside, something tightened, like a string being pulled too far. When the bill arrived, I glanced at the number, then at Emily. She was holding her glass, eyes fixed on her phone, as if the moment didn't exist. I waited. The seconds stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, I spoke, keeping my voice calm, suggesting that perhaps we could split the cost this time. Emily looked up, her expression shifting instantly from relaxed to cold. She asked me to repeat myself, as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. I explained that I'd paid for the first 2 dates, and felt it was reasonable to share now. The air between us froze. Emily set her glass down and said she wasn't used to paying on dates, that if I wasn't comfortable covering it, then we were probably looking for different things. What followed was an exchange steeped in tension. I felt as though I'd committed some unforgivable offense, even though reason told me my request wasn't excessive. Emily paid for her portion, but the act felt less like fairness and more like reluctant resentment. We left the restaurant in silence. There was no hug, no talk of meeting again. That night, I sent her a message, trying to explain how I felt, that I didn't want to feel like nothing more than a talking wallet. The message was never answered. A few days later, I realized I'd been blocked. My friends' reactions were divided. Some said I was being too calculating, that men should expect to pay, at least in the beginning. Others supported me, saying any relationship required mutual respect and balance. The conflicting opinions didn't bring clarity, they only deepened my confusion. I began questioning whether I had misread everything from the start, or whether I had ignored obvious signs simply because I wanted to believe this time would be different. In the days that followed, I noticed myself growing more guarded about dating. Every time I opened an app, I remembered Emily's expression when I mentioned sharing the cost, the feeling of being diminished, reduced to a means rather than a person. I started analyzing every small detail in new conversations, wondering whether the person across from me cared about who I was, or only what I could provide. That suspicion clung to me, seeping into my everyday thoughts, leaving me unsettled with myself. Some evenings, I sat alone in my apartment, staring out the window at the same gray city where I'd first met Emily. I thought about how dating had changed, how thin the line was between courtesy and being taken advantage of. The frustration didn't erupt into anger, it lingered quietly, persistently, like a scratch that refused to heal. I no longer trusted small gestures the way I once had, afraid of the unspoken expectations that might be hiding behind them. Listening to the feeling you can't explain. I still remember that evening clearly, even though many years have passed. Not because it was romantic or memorable in the way people usually describe a first date, but because it was the first time in my life I truly understood what it feels like when instinct screams a warning, while reason keeps trying to convince you that you are simply overthinking. It all began very normally, even pleasantly. I met him through a popular dating app in the United States, a place where millions of people talk every day, hoping to find someone to share their lives with. His name was Daniel Brooks. He lived in the suburbs of Portland, worked freelance, enjoyed reading, and liked watching documentary films. His profile photo showed a friendly face with a slightly crooked smile, the kind that seemed shy rather than confident. There was nothing about him that raised any immediate concern. Our early conversations were easy and light. Daniel was funny, responsive, and surprisingly attentive. He remembered small details I mentioned, from my preference for black coffee with no sugar to my habit of listening to podcasts before going to sleep. At times, I felt a quiet comfort in being noticed so carefully, without the usual shallow questions. He didn't rush things or push boundaries. Everything moved at a comfortable pace, and I slowly let my guard down. After about 2 weeks of messaging, Daniel suggested meeting in person. A small cafe near downtown, busy, public, on a weekend afternoon. I agreed without much hesitation. Before leaving, I sent the location and time to a close friend, a safety habit I had trained myself to follow. I remember smiling to myself, thinking I was probably being overly cautious for a simple coffee date. The cafe was warm, filled with golden light, the smell of roasted beans, and the low murmur of conversation. Daniel was already seated near the window. In person, he was taller than I expected, thin, with slightly slouched shoulders. When he stood up to greet me, he smiled, exactly like in his photos. For the first few minutes, everything felt fine. We talked about the weather, our work, and the familiar traffic problems in the city. Then, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere shifted. Daniel began talking about the films and podcasts he enjoyed. Many of them focused on crime stories, unsettling cases from different parts of the country. He spoke in great detail, lowering his voice, watching my reactions closely. I tried to brush it off with a polite smile, saying I didn't enjoy heavy topics during a casual coffee. He nodded, but not long after, he returned to those subjects, this time asking questions. He asked whether I had ever been afraid of someone, asked if I lived alone, asked about my daily routine, what time I usually came home, which streets I took most often. The questions were framed as curiosity, almost concern, but they sent a chill through me. I began answering vaguely, avoiding specifics. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet but firm sense told me that something was wrong. Daniel seemed to notice my hesitation. He leaned closer, lowered his voice, and said he was simply interested in understanding people better. But there was no warmth in his eyes. It felt less like empathy and more like observation. I glanced around the cafe. Other people were laughing, talking, completely unaware. The crowded space suddenly felt distant, as if I were alone at that table. I decided to end the date early. I said I had something to take care of and apologized for leaving so soon. Daniel went silent for a few seconds, then nodded. I stood up, grabbed my bag, my heart beating faster than it should have. As I turned to leave, I felt a hand close around my wrist. Not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough to stop me. That moment lasted only seconds, but it felt stretched beyond time. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Daniel said my name in a low voice, telling me we weren't finished talking yet, that there was no need to rush. His expression had changed completely. The polite mask was gone, replaced by something cold and unyielding. Instinct took over. I pulled my arm free and stepped back. I don't remember exactly what I said, only that my voice shook but carried far enough to draw attention. A few heads turned in our direction. Daniel released me immediately. His expression shifted again, unsettlingly fast, as if he had slipped his mask back into place. I didn't look back. I walked quickly out of the cafe, then broke into a run. Not a panicked sprint, but a determined escape toward the busiest street nearby. As I moved, I called the police, my words rushed and unsteady, telling them I felt threatened. I didn't stop until I saw a patrol car at the corner. Only then did my legs begin to weaken. The officers took me to the station to give a statement. They asked me to describe Daniel, to recount everything that happened inside the cafe. I tried to remember every word, every glance. While I sat there, hands wrapped around a warm cup of water, another officer entered the room and said they had found information about the man I described. Daniel Brooks was not unfamiliar to them. There had been multiple reports involving him, complaints of persistent harassment and following behavior, dates that ended in fear, messages that never seemed to stop, appearances in places no one expected him to be. Individually, each incident might not have been enough to hold him for long. Together, they painted a very clear picture. Hearing this, a cold wave ran through me. I thought about what might have happened if I had ignored my unease, if I had stayed a few minutes longer, if the cafe had been quieter. No one answered those questions, and perhaps no one needed to. After that night, it took time for me to feel safe going out alone again. Dating became something I avoided. Whenever someone asked too many personal questions too quickly, I instinctively pulled back. I learned to trust my instincts, even when I couldn't fully explain them. This story is not meant to spread fear, but to remind us that caution is never unnecessary. In a world that encourages openness, keeping an exit plan is a form of self-respect. Listening to your instincts is not weakness. It is a survival skill. And sometimes, the smallest decisions, the ones that feel rude or abrupt, are exactly what allow us to walk away safely from what seemed like an ordinary night. A date drowned by noise. That night began like an ordinary promise, even a gentle one, in the way promises tend to feel when you still have enough trust not to question them. I met Maya on a humid Friday evening in Los Angeles, when the last light of sunset was still trapped between glass buildings and the streets were beginning to slip into their half-awake, half-intoxicated rhythm. We had been messaging each other for more than a month, long conversations about work, small everyday exhaustion, jokes that were just enough to make you believe the person on the other side was kind, attentive, and most importantly, genuinely interested. Maya suggested we meet at a nightclub downtown, a place she described as not too loud, private enough to talk. I was never fond of crowded venues, but the way she said it made me believe it would be a calm evening, a natural next step after weeks of steady conversation. When I arrived, the sound hit my chest like a wave. The lights shifted constantly, colors bleeding into one another, while the smell of alcohol mixed with cheap perfume and sweat, forming a thick, suffocating atmosphere. Maya was standing near the bar, wearing a fitted black dress, her smile bright, as if she belonged there. She hugged me, closer than I expected, and said she was glad I came. For the first few minutes, everything unfolded just as I had hoped. We talked about harmless things. She laughed loudly, touched my arm lightly to emphasize a point. I felt present, not out of place, not like an extra in someone else's story. But after one more drink, the night began to slip off course. A group of people approached, clearly friends of Maya. She introduced me quickly, almost mechanically, as if my presence were a minor detail in a much larger picture. The music shifted into a heavier rhythm, and the dance floor filled. Maya pulled me toward it, but within minutes she had turned away, laughing and dancing with another man, then another. I stood there, unsure whether to follow or step back, while Maya seemed entirely comfortable leaving me behind, turning me into an unwilling spectator of her easy intimacy with strangers. I told myself I was overreacting. This was a nightclub, after all. People danced, talked, laughed, nothing unusual about that. But my body refused to listen to reason. Every time Maya leaned close to someone's ear to say something, every time her hand rested on someone's shoulder longer than necessary, something inside me eroded a little more. I looked around, searching for any sign that I still mattered, but her gaze passed over me as if I were a misplaced decoration. I left the dance floor and returned to the bar. The drink in front of me slowly disappeared, yet my mind grew sharper. From there, I watched Maya. She seemed like a different person, or perhaps this was who she truly was, and the long messages before had only been a carefully curated version. She smiled at too many people, danced with too many bodies, and showed no concern for where I fit into that scene. When she finally came back, sweat glistening on her forehead, eyes bright with music and alcohol, I tried to speak honestly. I told her I felt uncomfortable, that I thought this evening was meant to be just the two of us. Maya looked at me, surprised for a brief second, then laughed. She said I was taking things too seriously, that I should relax, that this was simply how she had fun. She kissed my cheek, just enough affection to soften the moment, but not enough to resolve anything. Before I could say more, she was pulled away again. The feeling of being pushed aside was not loud or explosive. It was quiet, persistent, and heavy. It clung to every thought, every breath. I began to wonder whether our earlier conversations had meant anything at all, or whether I was simply one of many people Maya kept around to fill different gaps in her life. That thought made me feel small and painfully naive. The night dragged on. The music grew louder, the lights harsher. I saw Maya dancing on a raised platform, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. For a brief moment, our eyes met, but she only smiled before turning away, as if that glance carried no obligation, no connection. I stood there among hundreds of bodies, yet felt unbearably alone. Near midnight, I decided to leave. I texted Maya that I was heading home, that I wasn't feeling well. The message was read, but there was no reply. I stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against my skin, but failing to lift the weight in my chest. I called a ride and watched the streetlights blur past the window, telling myself that maybe it was simply a matter of incompatibility. Not every meeting was meant to align. But the feeling did not fade in the days that followed. Maya did not text. I didn't either. A long silence settled between us, and within it, I tried to rearrange my memories, to rationalize what had happened. Then one afternoon, by pure coincidence, I saw a post on her social media. It was a photo taken at that same nightclub, captioned as a small social experiment she and her friends had done, meant to see who truly understands and accepts a free spirit. I read it again and again, unsure if I was misunderstanding. In the comments, Maya replied enthusiastically to her friends, mentioning how some people didn't pass, how their reactions were more interesting than expected. In that moment, I realized I hadn't just been part of a failed date. I had been part of a game I never agreed to play. The sense of betrayal sharpened. Not because she danced with others, but because she turned my feelings into material, into something to be observed and laughed about. I considered confronting her, but stopped. Some questions, once asked, only deepened the wound. I chose to cut all contact, deleted her number, unfollowed her accounts, tried to reclaim some sense of agency. I thought that would be the end of it, an unpleasant but necessary lesson. A few weeks later, I ran into Maya by chance at a small cafe. She recognized me first, that familiar smile appearing as if no distance had ever existed. She asked how I was, said that night wasn't a big deal, that I had misunderstood everything. When I mentioned the post, she shrugged, saying it was just a joke, that I was exaggerating. The way she spoke made me doubt my own memory, as if everything I had felt were merely products of imagination. We sat across from each other for a few brief minutes, long enough for me to realize that what unsettled me most was not the obvious disrespect, but her dismissal of my experience, her ability to reduce it to something insignificant. When I left the cafe, I felt another kind of emptiness, colder than before. In trying to forget, I realized that from the beginning, I had chosen to believe in an image constructed through a screen, ignoring small signs of misalignment. I had placed too many expectations on a single night, on someone who was still largely a stranger. When reality failed to meet those expectations, I felt betrayed. Maya behaved without regard, but I too had contributed to my own hurt by ignoring my intuition.